they'll be fine.
Are you sure?
Yeah, they
okay.
last quite a That should be good there.
Okay. It's a little ridiculous.
Yeah, if I could.
I was gonna introduce you, but then
It's okay. It's okay.
I still can.
That's okay. Do you want it on this thing?
It won't go in, I don't. Will it? Let's stay there.
Yeah, yeah. Go. Feel like you're ready to go to a gunfight. You got more wires in it than I see the communication than I see you.
Don't make that joke, keep it out of me.
I guess they didn't want anybody stealing this.
I was like looking like, what? How are you supposed to use this?
This is great. I love these sort of things.
Shouldn't just try to do it without the note, shouldn't I?
It's up to you. Whatever you want.
Can you like see me okay if I'm behind this?
Yeah, but I would shut these so you don't run into them. Oh, this is quite the production. Pretty awesome.
Sure, if you paid them, they'd be happy to put me in space.
We pay them. We pay them.
University?
Yeah, they get all the money in the study.
Well, I mean like KHS specifically. Hello.
I like bingo's and birthday parties.
With some background in therapeutic recreation and long-term care, followed by the findings of 2 studies that I'm going to share with you today. So study 1 was conducted prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and study 2, the data were collected during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'm going to kind of bring it all together and consider implications for the future in long-term care with regard to therapeutic recreation. So I just wanted to start with a little bit about myself and why research in long-term care is important to me, and why therapeutic recreation, I guess, in long-term care is important to me as well. And I started my first experiences in long-term care were as an Irish step dancer from about age 7 to about age 13. And my main audience was older adults who were living in long-term care. I come from a town in Ontario called Peterborough, which has an aging population. So we had a lot of long-term care facilities in my hometown, and particularly during the month of March, we would have March break, which always coincided with St. Patrick's Day. So my mother drove me around to long-term care facilities throughout the city with my fellow dancers to put on performances and then have a few sandwiches with green bread and then move on to the next long-term care facility. And I liked doing the dancing. I did not like the older adults in the long-term care facility at that time. They scared me, I felt overwhelmed, and I never really interacted with them other than doing the dance performance. So, kind of strange that I ended up here all these years later, after those terrifying experiences. Several years after that, when I was about 16, there was an ad in our local newspaper, because there were still ads in local newspapers back in those days, for calling for volunteers for the summer volunteer program at Fairhaven Home, which was the municipally run long-term care facility in my hometown of Peterborough. And my mother saw the ad and said, "You should really try this out. I think you would like it." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? I do not like old people." But she talked me into it, and I ended up that summer as a craft room volunteer, where I was paired with a resident, and we went down to the craft room once or twice a week, and I helped her complete her crafts. And I actually liked it so much after all of my initial resistance that I stayed on past the summer program and continued to visit with that resident during the school year as well for a couple of years, in addition to the summer volunteering program. And it was kind of that initial experience, the more positive experience, I guess, of finding meaning in volunteering in long-term care, and also recognizing a lot of the problems in long-term care that I knew at that point that I wanted to somehow be able to make a difference or change in that part of our society, I guess. And that's what led me to pursuing therapeutic recreation at the University of Waterloo for my undergraduate degree, where I was a co-op student, and I worked in several long-term care facilities in the recreation program. So the final picture up there is a picture of me in my last work term with one of the residents in a long-term care facility. After that, I did my master's, and then I spent 1 year working in a recreation department in a long-term care facility in Halifax. And so that got me out of those 4-month time frames into a year-long kind of employment situation, where I really got to see the benefits of therapeutic recreation over a longer period of time, and see how residents benefited from engaging in meaningful leisure, how they built relationships with each other, and really being able to make a difference in their lives. So that's a little bit about why this type of research is important to me, and why I kind of hope to continue moving in this direction in my research agenda. But I just want to turn now to explain what long-term care is. So long-term care, of course, is managed provincially, so the definitions vary depending on what province you live in. But the Government of Canada has this definition from 2004, where it's living accommodation for people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, people who need supervised care, including health services, personal care, so help with things like feeding, toileting, bathing, transferring, and having meals prepared, laundry, and housekeeping as well. In Canada, about 7.1% of older adults live in long-term care or seniors' residences. We have just over 2,000 long-term care homes here in Canada, just under 200,000 beds, according to recent statistics from the Canadian Institute for Health Information. The typical long-term care resident is 85 or older, has dementia and multiple chronic conditions. However, people who live in long-term care are actually quite diverse, and there are many younger adults, younger than 85 and even younger than 65, who reside in long-term care. Other research tells us that about 44% of people living in long-term care experience symptoms of or have a diagnosis of depression. So depression rates are really quite high in long-term care. Loneliness, boredom, all of these things really impact quality of life. So care in these facilities does tend to focus more on a medical model, or that's starting to change a little bit with culture change. It tends to focus on treating symptoms, on managing disease, rather than taking a more holistic approach. And when that happens, residents lose autonomy, they don't have very many meaningful relationships, and that really significantly impacts quality of life. In 2020, not long after the pandemic started and we began to see really tragic implications of the pandemic in long-term care, Estabrooks and colleagues provided a report about the situation in long-term care, and they identified several pre-existing failures that were going on even before the pandemic that the pandemic really started to highlight. One of these is lack of funding, so there's just not enough funds to support residents in long-term care. There is a lack of staffing in long-term care, as well as a lack of regulation, particularly for staff who are providing the most care. So personal support workers, care aides, are not regulated and are providing the most care for long-term care residents. They are also likely to be marginalized in terms of gender and race as well. So it's a difficult place to work for people who are taking on these jobs. Estabrooks and colleagues also highlighted that there are several inequities among residents, and they noted that the most vulnerable are least likely to have their voices heard in long-term care. So this is just very recent headlines. I just did a quick Google search a week or so ago and looked for some local headlines about what long-term care, what our portrayal of long-term care is in the news, and it's still very much COVID related right now. So the top left headline came from August 5th, 2021, and it was referring to the tragedy in extended care that had happened earlier. The other three are more recent, just in the past couple of months, so we can still see that there are outbreaks in long-term care. Visitors are still being restricted in some cases in long-term care, and people are still at risk of dying in long-term care because of COVID. And this is just local. If we went a little bit further and we looked at headlines from mid-2020, particularly from Ontario and Quebec, we would see a lot more tragedy in terms of what was going on in long-term care in those particular provinces. And I didn't go back too far, but I can remember other examples in the news of really terrible stories of poor care in long-term care. So that gives you a bit of a background on long-term care. I know it's kind of a bleak picture. I hope to make things a little bit more cheerful as I move into my discussion of therapeutic recreation. And I just want to start by kind of giving you a definition and describing what therapeutic recreation is, just so that we're all kind of on the same page moving forward. So therapeutic recreation, according to Robertson and Long, is the purposeful use and enhancement of leisure as a way to maximize overall health, well-being, and quality of life. So this is a really short, quick definition of therapeutic recreation. I like using it because I find it's very clear and concise, and you can just kind of wrap your head around it quickly. There are tons of definitions of therapeutic recreation. In my TR Foundations class, we go over 7 or 8 different definitions, but I'm just going to share 2 of them with you today. The second one is a little bit more in-depth, as you can see from the number of words on the slide here. This is Anderson and Hines' definition. They take a strengths-based approach to therapeutic recreation, so really focusing on clients' or participants' strengths and their goals and dreams rather than on deficits or illness or symptoms. So they define therapeutic recreation as the purposeful and careful facilitation of quality leisure experiences and the development of personal and environmental strengths which lead to greater well-being for people who may need assistance in achieving goals and dreams. So as I mentioned before, there are lots of different definitions of therapeutic recreation. All of those definitions do have some commonalities. First is that it is a purposeful use of recreation and leisure. So we're using recreation and leisure here to bring about some sort of positive change or to facilitate that change for our clients in therapeutic recreation. It involves enhancement of functioning through recreation and leisure. We see reference to the whole person or a holistic approach to care in therapeutic recreation, where again, we're not just following the medical model and focusing on treating symptoms, but really looking at that whole person in their environment and considering all aspects of their well-being from cognitive, social, emotional, and physical. And we're looking ultimately here to see some long-term improvements in quality of life. So why is this relevant to long-term care specifically? Well, the research on leisure and aging in general tells us that engaging in meaningful leisure does contribute to well-being in terms of the physical, social, emotional, and cognitive areas. And additional research tells us that when people have opportunities to participate in meaningful leisure, they may experience increased resilience. So leisure has a lot of benefits for older adults. They can use leisure to experience meaning, to learn new things, to maintain their current skills and abilities, to maintain relationships with family and friends, to express their identity, to express emotions, to cope with stress or later life transitions, and to reduce feelings of isolation and loneliness. Yet, while we know that leisure does contribute to well-being in later life, those who benefit most experience the most constraints. So research demonstrates that engagement in leisure and social activity does have positive implications, but some longitudinal research data shows that with increased age, people experience more constraints that limit engagement in leisure, and that's where therapeutic recreation comes in. Therapeutic recreation professionals can facilitate leisure opportunities for adults who experience additional constraints to engaging in leisure, particularly those who are living in long-term care. So what does a therapeutic recreation professional do? Well, they use the systematic therapeutic recreation process that consists of assessment, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So they assess the client's strengths and needs and help them identify goals that they may want to work on. Then they plan relevant programs to help the clients meet those goals and evaluate progress in achieving those goals. So we use this process in therapeutic recreation to really help our clients achieve their dreams and focus on their strengths. So getting back to, or bringing them all together, TR and long-term care, we know that needs often go unmet in long-term care. People often don't have their social needs met, their emotional needs met. They have very little choice in long-term care, and they have very little independence. And therapeutic recreation can kind of help to fill some of these gaps. So this study, published in the Annals of Long-Term Care, reminds us about the importance of having meaningful leisure activities for people who are living in long-term care homes. So Van Heitzman and I'll note that activities or recreation is one of the most important determinants of quality of life and well-being. And when these activities are individualized and tailored to people's interests and needs, then they can in fact provide that source of meaning, competence, connection, and pleasure. So there are, just to give you, there's not much literature in therapeutic recreation and long-term care. It's growing a little bit, but it's, there's not tons of it out there. What we do know is that meaningful leisure opportunities do provide chances to develop relationships in long-term care and to experience meaning. So that came from Lopez and Dupuis' work from 2014. Having opportunities for leisure helps to reduce depression and reduce poor health in long-term care. There's some research that suggests that tailored therapeutic recreation interventions can address responsive behaviors among residents who are living with dementia. So responsive behaviors refer to or when a person with dementia can't express themselves, so they express themselves in ways that society kind of deems unacceptable, like yelling or being aggressive or wandering around. And so having these tailored programs can help to reduce some of these behaviors. And I guess most importantly is that when people do have the opportunity to participate in enjoyable activities, they can experience dignity. So this is my good news slide compared to my previous slide that was bleak and depressing. Good things do happen in long-term care, often in the realm of therapeutic recreation. So these are also relatively recent headlines. Some of them happened or came out in the news before the pandemic. Some more recently. The one at the top, the 100-year-old woman learns gardening, was published this last September, and it was a story about a resident at Sherbrooke Community Center's long-term care facility in Saskatoon, where this resident had the chance to try something she'd never tried before and really enjoyed it and got a lot out of the experience and had a real sense of pride in being able to learn this new skill and try something like that she never expected to try. The remaining three headlines, which is kind of cool, are all about recreation programs that our alumni, our TR alumni, put on for their residents in long-term care here in Saskatchewan. So the one on the right, the top right, College Park 2, one of our alumni, runs the senior games on an annual basis for people to participate in at College Park 2. And then we have the boxing program that was at the Meadows in Swift Current. That article came out in 2019. And then the last one happened at Capel House here in Regina, again with one of our alumni who organized a pen pal program. And you can just see the light in my residents' eyes reading these letters. So there are some good things happening in long-term care. So with that, I'm going to move on to sharing the findings of some of my research. So the findings from study 1 come from a larger study that focused on therapeutic recreation professionals throughout Saskatchewan, not just those working in long-term care. But today I'm going to focus specifically on findings that came from 4 focus groups that included only participants who were working in long-term care. And I do want to acknowledge my research team who had played such an important role in this study, and I wouldn't be here today reporting this without them. So many thanks to all of the people who were part of this project. And I do want to acknowledge that it was funded by SSHRC as well. With you today is to explore TR professionals' perspectives on working in long-term care here in the province and explore how they describe therapeutic recreation, how they perceive their roles, and the opportunities and barriers for supporting engagement in meaningful leisure. So this study was guided by the principles of appreciative inquiry, which focuses on what's going well. It's much like therapeutic recreation, it's kind of a strengths-based approach to research that, while it doesn't completely ignore problems, it really kind of tries to get at things that are going well. So I'm going to share problems with you today, but I'm also going to share kind of what's going right in long-term care or was before the pandemic. Appreciative inquiry involves a 4D cycle of discovery, dreaming, designing, and destiny. And so the findings here today come from the discovery phase, which involves inquiry into the best of what is. So as I mentioned before, we had 4 focus groups with TR professionals and recreation staff who were working in long-term care. So the focus groups were audio recorded and transcribed, and then we used thematic analysis to analyze the data. This is not something I would recommend. These were really big focus groups. We had 53 participants across the 4 focus groups. It actually worked out surprisingly well, but I still don't recommend it. So we had about 10 to 12 participants in each group. Not surprisingly, the majority of the participants identified as female. Most of them worked as recreation coordinators, which in Saskatchewan, that position requires a diploma in recreation therapy. Most worked in urban locations. Most were working full-time. And yeah, I think that's all I need to say about that slide. So there are 3 main findings that I'm going to talk about today, including how the participants felt they contributed to the lives of the residents who were living in their long-term care facilities, any misperceptions they experienced in terms of other people's views of what therapeutic recreation is, and the obstacles that they faced in implementing therapeutic recreation programs. So the first theme of relating to contributing to residents' lives really shows how the participants believed they were able to make a difference in the lives of the residents through therapeutic recreation programming. So in this quote, we can see how the participants viewed their kind of day-to-day job as the resident comes in and we get to see how we can make your day better, and we can adapt things if you need to have them adapted, and we can introduce you to new things. And I love the end of this quote. It's awesome how many people we get and come in and say, well, I can't draw, and now they're painting these huge pictures that they never knew they could do. Again, this quote here emphasizes kind of the choice and the adaptation that therapeutic recreation professionals provide to residents in long-term care. So they can't do what they used to do, and I give them the chance for them to do it differently with the same amount of pleasure, and they feel whole again in a lot of ways. And in this quote again, we see the emphasis on choice. Oh, there's a typo on that, I apologize for that. I believe that TR is supporting people in what they choose to do and helping them carry through their wishes as opposed to just telling them. It's getting to the root of their passions and helping them to live out those things and carry them out with them. There's 2 typos on that slide. It's funny, you practice it and don't notice the typos until you're in front of an audience. And finally, the participants really talked about the importance of their role in bringing joy to the lives of their residents. No matter how much joy that is, some days are more joyful than others for us on a daily basis, and the same is true in long-term care. But if they could even just provide a little bit of joy or facilitate opportunities to experience joy, then they really felt like they were making a difference in the lives of their residents. So the participants also told us a lot about the misperceptions that they hear about what therapeutic recreation is from non-therapeutic recreation or non-recreation staff who are working in their facilities. So the title, Beyond Bingo and Birthdays, kind of comes from this quote. I think they look at us like you're the bingo and birthday party ladies. I don't know why ladies, but that seems to be a thing. As if we're just doing it as a distraction, and it's not. So that definition I talked about at the beginning about therapeutic recreation being purposeful, that gets missed by people who are kind of outside looking in at therapeutic recreation. They just see it as like kind of fun stuff that's a distraction from what else might be going on in their lives, rather than having that purposeful, goal-based approach. And again, this is a similar quote. We again see that misperception that therapeutic recreation is viewed on as the babysitters, that anyone can go to a program. It doesn't matter what the program is or whether or not the person is actually interested in the program or would benefit from the program. So that perception that we're just like babysitters. And then this misperception highlights the belief that having a large group program is better than a small group program. So a large group program where a lot of residents, like 50 or 100 residents, might come to the event, looks really good because it looks like everyone's participating and having a really good time from an optics perspective, so management really likes that according to this participant, but you lose that therapeutic value that you get in the small group, more goal-oriented sessions. So finally, I'm going to talk about some obstacles to therapeutic recreation in long-term care. One of them is engaging in unrelated tasks, doing feeding during mealtime, portering residents. All of these activities take away from planning and implementing therapeutic recreation programs. The participants also identified the lack of educated staff as a problem in long-term care. As I mentioned before, in Saskatchewan, to be a recreation coordinator requires a diploma in therapeutic recreation. To be a recreation therapist requires a degree, but recreation workers only require like a grade 12 education, and they have no background in leisure theory or what therapeutic recreation is, which makes it really hard for them to plan relevant programs. And the other obstacle kind of relates back to that misperception that I mentioned, was that the belief that anyone could go to a therapeutic recreation program rather than considering that programs are designed with particular residents in mind. So the people, nursing staff, for example, would bring residents to programs just so they could have a break rather than seeing like the specific goals of that program. So to summarize study 1, the professionals in long-term care in Saskatchewan were working really hard to provide opportunities for residents to experience leisure and to build and sustain relationships, yet the misperceptions and obstacles were impacting their ability to facilitate meaningful leisure. So it's challenging before the COVID-19 pandemic to provide meaningful leisure programs because of the lack of resources and misperceptions in long-term care. Yet those were exacerbated when the pandemic came along, which brings us to study 2, which Jenna is my co-author, Jenna Johnstone. She's a certified therapeutic recreation specialist who's living in Vancouver. At the time of this study, she was working as a senior recreation therapist in long-term care and approached me to do this study because she really wanted to get a better understanding of what was going on during the pandemic. So we collected this data during the first wave. So I already talked about the pre-existing failures in long-term care in Canada that were really exacerbated by the pandemic. We know that the residents in long-term care were at high risk for negative outcomes as a result of COVID-19. And actually about 14,000 long-term care residents died between March 2020 and February 2021 in Canada due to COVID-19, with more than 800 outbreaks in the first few months of 2020, the first few months of the pandemic. In addition to So in order to protect residents' physical health because of COVID-19 that they were at great risk for, restrictions were put in place to reduce the risk of infection. Of course, these restrictions varied because it was a provincial jurisdiction, but federally, the government made several recommendations like eliminating non-essential activities, so that might be leisure activities, reducing non-essential visitors, so having family and friends come to visit, reducing like volunteers, equipment restrictions as well happened. So that really reduced the opportunities for leisure in long-term care. So with that, the purpose of this study was to explore how TR professionals adapted their practice to accommodate the public health restrictions and to share their perspectives on resident well-being. So because of the COVID restrictions and because we wanted to reach a broad range of TR professionals across the country, we did an online survey that we distributed through the national and provincial Therapeutic Recreation Associations. Our survey was 30 questions long. It included both closed-ended questions that were really just about demographic data and open-ended questions that were aimed at getting at the experiences of these professionals during the pandemic. And again, we used thematic analysis to analyze that open-ended data. So we received 94 complete surveys that were included in our data. The majority of our participants came from Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario, with a few participants from Newfoundland, New Brunswick, here in Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and Quebec. Again, most identified as female, most worked full-time, 66% worked in public long-term care homes versus 34% who worked in private homes. So there are 3 findings from this study that I want to share with you today, including how that practice shifted because of the COVID-19 restrictions, how those shifts impacted resident quality of life, and how the professionals, the TR professionals, used their own strengths and resources to continue to provide person-centered care as best as they could. So the first theme, shifting TR practice, reflects the ways that the TR professionals had to change their practice in response to the restrictions, and the biggest change was that they spent the majority of their time facilitating virtual visits with family members. So programming stopped for the most part, a lot of programming stopped, and the energy just went into organizing, scheduling these calls, learning how to use all of the different apps that we use for virtual visits, making sure they had the right apps to match up with what the families had. All of that was, as you can see, very challenging. And what that meant was that there was no time left to do actual therapeutic recreation. So they didn't have time to do the TR process of assessment, planning, implementation, and evaluation. And a lot of participants talked about having to leave their activity calendar behind and just kind of see where the day went when they got to work in the morning. So huge changes, I'll just go back to that slide. Since they were largely providing those large group programs prior to the pandemic and they could no longer gather for those types of activities, they did change focus to more individualized and small group programs where possible. So they identified several ways that these restrictions had impacts on the residents from their own perspectives. So these aren't chart reviews or anything like that. They're just like how they perceived their own residents responding. So they found that they didn't have the ability to provide programs. They weren't able to meet resident needs because of lack of supplies. The second quote on the slide highlights how residents had no stimulation for months. They were in bed, they started to decline. They were unable to maintain or enhance their social, emotional, physical, cognitive, and spiritual abilities that we focus on in therapeutic recreation. Makes sense here. We know this from the media as well, that the residents were lonely, they were sad. If there was depression in long-term care before, then there was certainly depression was exacerbated when these restrictions were brought in. And people kind of became more apathetic. Residents became more apathetic. They couldn't see their friends. They were less likely to join what therapeutic recreation programs were offered. Yet, some good things may have come out of this. They really drew on their strengths and resources as recreation therapists who already had to be flexible and adaptable because the environment in long-term care can change and the residents can change. So they were able to draw on that flexibility and adaptability during the first wave of the pandemic. And they started to really appreciate the benefits of the small group programming and the individualized one-on-one programming, and found in some cases they built stronger relationships with some of the residents and were able to provide meaningful opportunities for leisure. They also found they could use their own strengths to help out other people, other staff members, and other residents. I learned that I can be a pillar of strength for residents, even when I'm concerned for myself. They also helped out their team members. They reminded people about self-care. We had the self-care bulletin board with tips and tricks to stay healthy. I learned that I'm a caring person and thrive in an ever-changing environment. So they learned a lot about themselves. They learned a lot about how to adapt programs in this situation. They learned a lot about technology as well. So they were not only using it for virtual visits, but they adapted technology in other ways to provide meaningful leisure opportunities for residents. So we know that the professionals experienced drastic changes in daily practice, which limited their ability to engage in the TR process, yet they were able to draw on their strengths and resources to provide person-centered care. And in doing so, they were able to support some residents, not all residents for sure, but some residents to experience meaningful leisure and pleasure through this difficult time. So what does this mean for the future? And this is kind of where I'm speculating a little bit here, kind of things I hope change in the future based on what we've learned through the pandemic. We know from study 1 that the participants want to provide meaningful opportunities for leisure, and they did their best to continue to contribute to the residents' lives despite the restrictions in the first wave of the pandemic by trying to help them continue to find joy in everyday life, even if that looked differently than it did before the pandemic. By maintaining that flexibility and spontaneity that they had before the pandemic and really had to bring into their practice during the pandemic, that may help TR professionals to create even more person-centered environments. And this is in keeping with Fortune and Dupuis, who argued in 2018 that when we move away from the activity calendar that's so common in long-term care, we can actually have better connections between residents and have more opportunities for spontaneous leisure experiences. A lot of the participants talked about kind of moving away from that large group programming and really continuing to focus on the small group and individualized programs after the pandemic, if there is a normal after the pandemic, and really continuing to support residents in that way rather than just having the large group bingo programs and birthday parties. Participants really talked about the benefits, again, of technology and bringing technology into these facilities for residents to use and have additional leisure opportunities. And I suspect that will continue well into the future, particularly as baby boomers age who might be more comfortable with technology and might have their leisure enhanced by technology before they're moving in long-term care and want to take that with them. I think a key takeaway from this is that we do need to do a better job at considering TR professionals' perspectives and experience to really lend insight into how we can address the pre-existing failures as we move forward following the pandemic. Again, their perspectives are often unheard. They often don't have a voice at the table. Nursing is prioritized, and so, which makes sense in some ways, but I think that we can really listen to their strengths-based approach to improve the environment. So I just wanted to share this quote. I thought this was a particularly heartwarming quote from our survey that a participant had written on there, and it reminds us really of how adaptable and flexible therapeutic recreation professionals are and how they will be able to move forward despite the burnout and stress that they are currently experiencing. So to wrap up my presentation today, we know that leisure can play an important role in aging well, and therapeutic recreation professionals use a strengths-based, person-centered approach for residents to engage in meaningful leisure, and their flexibility and adaptability may enable them to support ongoing change in the long-term care system. So I'll end it there and see if there's any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Rebecca, for that excellent overview.